This is the level of performance we can get in transfemoral amputees these days. This is some recording from the London Paralympics, and you can see you've got really quite a phenomenal level of performance. Two things have happened over recent years. First of all, prosthetic components have got an awful lot better, but actually the amputees have got an awful lot better as well. They go through a hell of a lot more training than they ever did in the past. As engineers, we tend to concentrate on the prosthetic components and assume that amputee gait is determined by the componentry. And we wanted to investigate a little bit more how much the amputee actually is involved in this process. And in this presentation today, I want to make the comparison in two ways. First of all, on the energy cost of movement, and secondly, on the gait patterns. If you look at a number of studies that have been published over the years, this is studies of unilateral transfemoral amputee gait and the energy cost, and you can see that there's a large number of studies being done, and they come up with quite a wide range of results. If we look at studies published over the last 10 years, the average oxygen consumption of a unilateral transfemoral amputee is about 0.24 milliliters per kilogram per meter. Okay. And at the same time, we've got a number of studies that have used a healthy cohort, and we can therefore calculate that the energy cost of transfemoral amputation is about 50% more than that of walking without an amputation. As Jamie drew attention to when he was looking at the energy storage and return feet, there's also been a revolution in microprocessor controlled knees for prosthesis. So this is a number of studies that have controlled microprocessor with conventional knees, and you can see it makes very little difference to the energy cost. There's an argument that you might accept this because the main reason for a microprocessor controlled knee is to control variations in walking speed, and this particular study was just saying how can you walk at a particular speed. So it may not be that surprising. So the general aim of this research was to identify the specific biomechanical factors that lead to that increased energy in the cost of amputee gait. But the aim of this, seeing this is work in progress, the main aim of this is if you like, a preliminary summary of the data we've collected so far, and to compare the data we've collected with that we've seen in the literature. And I think the results for this are interesting enough in themselves. So first of all, the methods, and the basic method here was to do oxygen consumption methods and optoelectronic gait analysis at the same time. So this is one of our amputees who's kitted out with an oxygen mask and a set of markers. We chose to work with the military amputees who've completed the rehabilitation program at our main centre for veteran rehabilitation in Britain, and at least all these patients are 6 months after delivery of the current limb. And the important thing about this is these are very highly motivated young men. One of them, the week before we'd done them, had rowed across the Atlantic, and another one under similar circumstances had walked across Greenland. These are not your average amputees. They are really probably the highest functioning amputees you can imagine outside the Olympic Stadium. We quite like to go for round figures, so we looked at 10 unilateral transtibial amputees, 10 unilateral transfemoral amputees, 10 bilateral transfemoral amputees. There's an awful lot of them. If you get your leg blown off these days by an explosive device, it tends to take both legs off and not just one. And we had 10 healthy military controls who we thought were as close as possible a match to the performance these guys would have had before their amputation. The prostheses had a range of state-of-the-art feet. The majority of the unilateral transfemoral amputees used Endolite KX06 knees, and the majority of the bilateral transfemoral amputees used Genium knees. These are all state-of-the-art Anki-Dori singing and dancing prostheses. The test protocol was to use a Cortex Metamax energy consumption. We used 2 minutes walking over ground to establish what the self-selected walking speed was. And then we did 5 minutes of standing to get a resting rate, and 5 minutes of walking, of overground walking. We took the last minute of each of those 5 minutes as the oxygen, steady state oxygen consumption. And we used gross mass normalization. As an engineer, I'd prefer to use non-dimensional net normalization, but we wanted to compare this with what other people had written about, so we had to go along with what was written in the literature. So let's have a look at the results. And first of all, the study for walking speed was really quite interesting, in that you'll see that our transtibial amputees actually walked faster than our control group. Our transfemoral amputees were just a little bit slower, and our bilateral transfemoral amputees actually were still walking pretty damn fast, considering that they've got both legs amputated above the knee. If you come down, you'll see that they adjusted stride length and cadence in pretty much the same way that you or I would adjust stride length and cadence if making similar changes to walking speed, in that you've got round about an equal change in stride length and cadence to achieve these changes in speed. And if you look at oxygen consumption, that's the oxygen consumed per unit time, you get what you might expect. The transtibials are a little bit more expensive than the controls, then the transfemorals, and then the bilateral transfemorals. Interestingly, if you look at energy cost, the transtibial amputees have exactly the same energy cost as the controls. And that's actually because they're walking a little bit faster. Okay, so the increased rate, but walking faster, means that the energy cost per meter is exactly the same. The unilateral transfemorals are only 20% higher. Remember that the figure from the literature is 50%. And actually, our bilateral transfemorals were only 60% higher than the cost of walking without in non-amputees. If we look at the results of this study compared with all other studies, you'll see first of all that we've got the lowest oxygen cost that's been recorded in any study of amputee gait. And we wanted to ask why is it that this? And one of the things we've got is we've got young military amputees. There is one other study that is on young military amputees, and you'll see they've got a low energy cost, but it's by no means the lowest. So it's not just the fact that we're looking at the young military amputees. There's a number of studies we wondered whether it was the fact that they were overground walking as opposed to being on treadmills. And you'll actually see the next lowest study was also a study that was done of overground walking. All the others are on treadmills. It's possible that in amputees it's a little bit more difficult to adapt your gait to a treadmill than it is for anybody else. And then we actually looked at walking speed. And in terms of the amount of data we normally get in clinical biomechanical studies, the R-squared value is actually reasonably high here, given that's R-squared and not just R. And you can see there's a fairly strong correspondence between the speed at which you're walking when you're doing these energy studies and your cost of walking. And this data, sorry, my highlighting isn't working very well, but this is the data from our study, which would show that there's perhaps one of the reasons, and it's association rather than a reason, I suppose, but basically we've got amputees that are walking particularly fast and they're also walking particularly efficiently. We don't know which comes first. It's a chicken and egg. Do they walk fast because they're walking efficiently, or are they efficient because they're walking fast? We'll come back to that one. Okay. I think that slide is actually wrong there. I don't think those are actually unilateral transfemoral amputees, because I'm now starting to talk about the unilateral transtibial amputees. But you can see that the same thing is occurring, is that we've got the lowest recorded oxygen consumption from any of the studies in the literature. Okay. Again, the overground walking tends to be a little bit less energy costly than the treadmill walking, but there are treadmill studies that show low figures. But interestingly, again, if we plot the correlation with walking speed, we find that in the unilateral transfemoral amputees, I'm confusing myself, these are the transfemoral amputees, I was talking about the transtibial amputees earlier. If you look at the transfemoral amputees, there's still a strong correlation with walking speed. And again, this is our data, which shows that our amputees are the ones that are walking fastest. They're also the ones that are walking with the lowest energy cost. There are very few studies of bilateral transfemoral amputees. It's only really as a result of modern warfare that you get them in large quantities. But again, we get the same thing, that our data is the lowest in the that's been published so far. And again, if you plot the cost against walking speed, you'll see that amputees that walk faster are the ones that show the lowest cost. Interestingly, if you plot the trend lines of walking speed against oxygen cost for all three amputee groups, you're getting very similar trends. And when you plot our data points from the study we've done, all of them are showing very low walking costs and very high walking speeds. The two are going hand in hand. So the conclusion of this, this first part of the study is that oxygen cost appears to be determined more by the characteristics of the amputee than by the prosthetic components. Okay. It's interestingly, the thing that varies across those amputees is how quickly they're walking. They've actually got very similar prosthetic componentry, particularly given that the microprocessor controlled knees don't have a great deal of effect on walking at your self-selected speed. So these are groups that have got the same prosthetic components, and it seems to be that the energy cost is determined by the particular group of amputees rather than the prosthetic components. And it may, of course, therefore be that the design of the rehabilitation program is actually more important than the selection of prosthetic components for reducing energy cost. So let's move on to, that was me being a bit outside my realm of comfort. Let's go to what I specialize in, and let's have a look at gait patterns. So this is the same data from the same study that we're reporting. We used a Vicon system with 10 T-series cameras and 4 Amputee force plates. I'm going to just talk about the kinematics because we haven't got time to talk about the kinetics as well. We used 39 markers in the 6 degree of freedom model in order to get the results. And first of all, one thing that interested me is that from my practice, this didn't appear to be a normal control cohort. If you look at it, they've got reduced anterior pelvic tilt throughout the gait cycle. In most cohorts I looked at, you'd expect about 10 degrees. They've got a tendency for increased hip extension, which of course would go along with that pelvic tilt. And they've got a tendency to have full extension at initial contact. And if you think about it, this is what the soldiers are taught to do. This is marching, okay? You have a very straight back and you extend your knee at initial contact. And we hadn't asked them to march, but I think if you train soldiers for long enough, you end up with a different gait pattern to the normal cohort that we'd come across if we just picked anybody off the street. So it emphasizes the need for having a control cohort that's matched the particular group of patients that you're looking at. If you look at the transtibial amputees, you see the first thing is that given that these guys don't have a foot, how remarkably similar the gait pattern is to normal. So if we look at the major differences, there's a slightly shorter prosthetic stance time, but if I hadn't drawn your attention to it, I'm not sure you'd have noticed that too much. There's a mild increase in pelvic tilt in late prosthetic swing, which is possibly to try and get the leg through. Okay, and we've got a mild increase in hip flexion at the same time. Okay. We've got reduced stance phase knee flexion, which isn't all that surprising because that requires more ankle movement than you've got available in a standard prosthesis, even the modern ones. Oops, sorry, I've managed to flip out there. Down. I'll use down rather than end, shall I? And we've got reduced plantar flexion in early swing, which of course is almost inevitable because, as Jamie was talking about, you can't get active plantar flexion out of a foot, however you choose to design it at the moment. And the bottom line is the differences from controls are generally pretty small. If you look at the transfemoral amputees, we'll actually see, again, the overall impression is these are walking very similarly to the control cohort. We've still got the shorter prosthetic stance time. We've got a strange little movement into more posterior pelvic tilt in early swing. And I think what's happening there is it's a mechanism to help swing the leg through if you haven't got an active push-off. So I think that's what we're seeing there. We're seeing no stance phase knee flexion on the prosthetic side, despite the fact that these guys are wearing knee units that from the sales literature, allow them to do it. They're not choosing to use it. And of course, if you don't flex your knee, you're going to have early hip extension in first double support. And again, they've got a prosthetic foot, so they don't plan to flex it in late stance or early swing. On the sound side, they've got a little bit of dorsiflexion in late stance, which we suspect is a slight vaulting mechanism in order to get a little bit more help with clearance because they're missing a leg. I've done it again, bugger. Excuse me. These are the bilateral amputees. Again, so these guys don't have anything below the mid femur on either side. And again, the overall impression is they've got an extremely good gait pattern. Note the high degree of symmetry there, despite the fact that none of these amputees are purely symmetrical. Okay, we've now got an increased anterior pelvic tilt. I would actually say that's a fairly normal one. It's less military than it was before. We've got reduced hip extension in late stance, which of course goes hand in hand with that. We've got the same little movement into more posterior pelvic tilt in early swing that we had in the unilateral transfemoral, so I think there's the same explanation for that. We've got reduced stance phase knee flexion, but it's interesting in this group, it's not zero. So this group is actually using the stance phase knee flexion that's available in the prosthesis, whereas for some reason the unilateral transfemorals weren't, although remembering that they're using different knee units. Both of them have stance phase knee flexion, but they're different designs. And again, no prosthetic plunged in swing, but again, the overall conclusion here is there's remarkably few abnormal gait features. If you look in coronal plane, you come to pretty much the same conclusion. And one of the interesting things here is we're generally taught in prosthetics that an amputation inevitably leads to pelvic asymmetries. And this group here is showing very little evidence of any pelvic asymmetry. Okay. In the transverse plane, again, the overall pattern is pretty much the same across all the crates. The only thing that's different is on the transfemoral groups, they tend to have a little bit more internal foot progression, and of course that's not the way they walk. That's the way the prosthetist has aligned them. Basically, the prosthetist chooses whether you want to have an internal or an external foot rotation. So the combination of the amputee and the prosthetist have chosen for that, rather than it being a natural part of the walking, if you like. Okay. The other thing to point out is that these amputees are incredibly consistent in their gait pattern. Okay, you can see that the width of the error bars is pretty much the same in the amputees as it is in the able-bodied cohort. So they've got a consistent pattern as well as a fairly normal one. I just want to finish off by presenting this in terms of the gait profile score. So this is something I've invented. It's a way of measuring how abnormal a gait pattern is. And what we do is we strip out all the data apart from the average trace, and so this is the green is the average trace from a healthy cohort. The red is the trace from a particular individual. And you can actually see that the area between those two curves gives an indication of how abnormal the traces are. If traces are similar, there's a very small area. If traces are different, there's a very big area. So just by calculating that area, actually as an engineer, I take the root mean square average rather than the pure area. But we get quite a good indication of how far that patient is from normal. And we just take the average of those over all of the 9, what I would call key clinical parameters. And what we find here is that, as you might expect, the transtibials are a little bit further from the average. I should point out that none of us walk with the average gait pattern, okay? You're all a little bit different from average, so the baseline score isn't 0. It turns out the average score is about 5 degrees. So on average, across your parameters, you're 5 degrees different from the average. You'll see that the unilateral transtibials, they look higher, but actually it's only a degree higher. So the average for the controls is 5 degrees different from normal. The average for the unilateral transtibials is 6 degrees different from the normal cohort. The unilateral transfemorals are only a little bit higher, and the bilateral transfemorals are still only 8 degrees different from normal on average. There's been quite a small amount of work done with the GPS in amputees. It was developed originally to look at children with cerebral palsy. For a more clinical audience, this might make a little bit more sense, but this is the most mild category of cerebral palsy, okay? And they have the same gait abnormalities as bilateral transfemoral amputees from this cohort. Really saying these guys are walking really well. There have been a couple of other studies looking at the gait profile score in amputees, one from Australia, I'm not quite sure whether, and one from Italy, I think. Certainly with a name like that, it would suggest it. You can see that basically the unilateral transtibial amputees have higher gait profile scores than the unilateral transfemoral amputees in those studies. They're not, however, directly comparable because they're an older cohort of elderly and more frail amputees. But certainly it's showing that the gait profile score is very small in these groups. So overall, the point I want to make is that we've been taught for a long time that amputees can't walk normally. And actually, it looks like when you've got a group of highly motivated, highly rehabilitated, young, fit amputees, they can walk almost normally and with much higher levels of performance in terms of both the gait pattern and the energy cost than has been considered in the past. That comes across from the gait profile score. It comes across from the energy cost studies. So we've worked out that with this particular group, the performance is much better than in previous studies, despite similar prosthetic provision, at least for walking at self-selected speeds. And it suggests that that walking ability is more dependent on the amputee than it is on the prosthesis. And I think for us in bioengineering, that gives us an interesting challenge, is that we spend an awful lot of time studying the prosthesis. I think we've got to spend a bit more time studying the amputee. So thanks very much. I'll take questions if I've got a little bit of time.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I was wondering, we didn't go over the kinetics, but are they as similar as the kinematics?
They're pretty good. We haven't completed the analysis of that at the moment, but they're pretty good. Again, you know, the big things that you might expect, it's very difficult for an amputee to get push off in the second part of the gait cycle. So they're down where you'd expect, but they're not down as much as they're down where you would have expected, but not as much as we would have expected.
You spoke about the group being extremely motivated.
Yeah.
The thing about it is that how much more training was this group doing on a general basis as opposed to other healthy normal?
Well, so I think this is the difference. Some of these guys, I don't know why, if you got your leg blown off in combat, I don't know why you want to go back to combat. But some of these transtibial amputees' ambition is to get back into the combat zone. So they are training in the same way as your commando type troops. So yes, this isn't a typical hospital rehabilitation where we're quite happy if you can get to the toilet and back. This is rehabilitation that's getting back to pretty much elite performance in terms of military function, which I think you can equate to elite performance in terms of athletic function as well.
Do you think it's feasible then to build something like that into general rehabilitation programs?
I think one of the things that interests me, and I know is interesting to people at Headley Court, is what can we transfer into general rehabilitation. I think certainly for your younger traumatic amputees or your cancer amputees who are young people that want to get active, encouraging them to be as active as possible and giving them specific training to do that is going to lead to better outcomes. The interesting thing is what we should be doing with the more typical elderly amputees. And can we be pushing them more? If we push them more in the rehabilitation, because we accept if you can get to the loo and back, you're rehabilitated. Maybe we should be pushing them more than that, and we'd be getting better results. I particularly like this correlation between the oxygen cost and the walking speed. And perhaps you could have a rehabilitation regime that's about trying to get you walking as fast as possible, at least in the clinic. Not suggesting that you sprint everywhere as an elderly amputee, but as part of the training regime to have more emphasis on speed and high level function.
I wondered if the prosthetic component prescription would be more applicable in that group of elderly amputees as such. It'd be interesting to see a similar study with a more typical.
That's one of the fascinating things. At the moment, there's huge amounts of money going into these high-end prostheses. And now you have to be careful because they're all about walking on non-level ground and up slopes and going upstairs and things like that. So it's not just all about level walking. But the take-home message from this is actually investing in the amputee is probably at least as important as investing in the prosthesis. It might be the other way around in more challenged amputees. It might be that providing more expensive components for the more challenged amputees is in some ways more beneficial than these guys who can do it on a relatively standard prosthesis.